Hello, all beautiful people all over this challenging but very magical planet. My name is Robert Canis, and this is another Beyond the Courage podcast. Today, I'm super excited. We have a very interesting guest, a superbly interesting persona. Jason Grechanik is our guest today. How are you doing, Jason?
Very well. Thank you for having me on, Robert.
I really love your energy. There's like enormous amount of calmness within you. The way you speak, your voice, your energy, your aura is so beautiful. You also have your podcast, which is called the Universe Within. It's such a beautiful name. How did you came out with this idea? And would you be so kind and talk to our viewers and listeners a bit more about it, about the whole
Sure.
idea, about the whole journey, the journey within.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on, Robert, and thank you for doing what you're doing. The podcast came about. I would say it was really a reflection of. Really just my own growth and work. I had been interested in spirituality for a very long time, probably ever since I was a child, although I may not have put it in those terms. But I had an interesting childhood in that I traveled the world a lot as a young child with my father. I was exposed to a lot of different cultures, especially kind of what we would call more indigenous cultures, very remote cultures. And so I think even these kind of aspects of shamanism and spirituality, I was very interested in as a child. I became very interested in plants, plants as medicine, plants as food, plants as beings. That led me to the Amazon rainforest, where I began working with ayahuasca. It was very life-changing for me. I think it was something that I was deeply looking for, was this very direct experience with a higher consciousness, with God, with the spirits of plants. And that really led me on a long journey of really living, learning, working with different traditional cultures in the Amazon. And then at a certain point, actually, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, for the first time, I found myself with time on my hands, which was something that I didn't have up until that point, because my work was quite all-consuming. It was very often 18-hour days, 7 days a week, working very intensely. So the idea, the name of the podcast was actually inspired by a dear teacher and friend of mine whose name is Dr. David Jubb. He used to have, this was before podcasts, but he had a little show on public TV called The Universe Within You. And so it was very much inspired by that idea. And it was really created to give voice to people who I respected, people working with plants, with different medicines, spirituality, and to give them a voice.
Awesome. Yeah, I really love it. I highly recommend to check out your podcast. You have very interesting guests. And also, as we spoke privately a little bit, you work with plant medicine. You spend a lot of time in the Valley of Peru, in the Temple of Light. Would you be so kind and talk about some of your transformations, like some deep experiences, how those plant medicines change your life, and how they affected your consciousness, your quality of life?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, for a large part of my life, I was very interested in spirituality and in religions and in different kind of esoteric practices, philosophies. And so I was very curious. I tried out a lot of things. I was also very interested in this common thread that all of these practices had. At a certain point, I became very interested in plants and plants as medicine and studying different traditional ways of working with plants. But I think something in my own knowledge or path wasn't being answered, and it was this more direct experiential aspect of plants. I was still working with plants in a more kind of allopathic way of using them to treat symptomatic responses. At a certain point, I had a very strong calling, and this may sound strange, but I had a very strong calling that I felt I was being called specifically by the plant ayahuasca, the plant brew ayahuasca, and that led me down to the Peruvian Amazon, and where you mentioned, I ended up working at a very large ayahuasca center called the Temple of the Way of Light. Those first ayahuasca experiences for me were very profound, and they very much heeded that call of something that I was looking for, which was putting me in touch with a consciousness, what maybe I would say a higher consciousness, a God consciousness, that allowed me to experience things and kind of brought answers to many questions that I had. So it was very profound and very life-changing. And that curiosity, that experience led me to return and to dive much deeper into these kind of traditional cultures and practices that worked with ayahuasca. That eventually led me to begin in the Amazon a very traditional practice, which they call the dieta, which is an experiential practice of directly learning from a plant, usually guided by someone who has a relationship to that plant, going into periods of isolation, of fasting, and usually working through some medium, whether that's ayahuasca or tobacco or other sacred plants, to really enhance and augment that connection to the plant you're working with to learn from. Eventually, I also found one of, if not my main teacher, who's, in Spanish they would say a tabaquero. It's one who works with tobacco, who really has a deep connection to that plant. And that dieta and that process of initiation with tobacco was very, very powerful for me. And it ended up basically becoming my life's path now, of really beginning to work with, to carry that lineage, to carry that medicine, to deepen my own connection to it. And now working with other people to connect them to the world of plants via that medium.
As we have spoken privately, you mentioned that you were born in States. Do you remember your first journey to States after spending some times with plant medicines? Do you remember, like, what was the reaction of the close people to you? Because a lot of people in Western world it's not that open-minded. I mean, maybe nowadays psychedelics becoming more and more popular. Do you remember that first journey after this transformation, and what were you communicating to your close ones?
Well, interestingly, I actually wasn't born in the States. I was born in Sri Lanka.
Oh, okay.
But to American parents, so I grew up in the U.S. I think ayahuasca wasn't, or working with plants wasn't a huge shock or difference to my friends or family, because I had already been working with plants. I was already very interested in spirituality, so I think it was just something else that I was doing, maybe a natural progression. Also, like I still was back and forth between the states. I mean, I would go back a few times every year, even when I was living in the Amazon. I think those things for me were never very separate. it was always very interesting because I would remember when I was working at the Temple of the Way of Light, people would come down and they'd see me in the jungle in the Amazon, kind of with machetes and rubber boots and seemingly living very fluidly in the Amazon. And I think there was often this kind of view that was somehow like shocking. But I also grew up in the woods. I grew up in Virginia, and it's very lush forest there, and so the Amazon always felt like home to me.
Mm-hmm.
Working with these plants also very much felt in a way like coming home. It was a remembering of something. It always felt very natural, very, very beautiful. So I think for me there was never much of a shock of a separation. And so I think in that way, for those around me, it was the same. There was no shock or separation. I think I was very fortunate in that my family has always been very supportive of me and what I do. They probably still don't understand it fully, but they've always been very supportive. And I think one of the things that's always very useful as practitioners of these medicines or being bridges of these traditions is it's always very important to speak to people in their own language in the same way that we're literally speaking English right now because we can understand that. But if we were speaking Mandarin, or if you were speaking Mandarin to me, I'd have no idea what you were speaking about. So not just in terms of the literal language, but the metaphorical language, the emotional resonance, the ways that we speak to people are very important, and so I think it's always very valuable and really essential to always speak to people in a way that they can understand, and that helps to bridge any potential gaps that there may be.
Do you remember what was the core message of the spirit of ayahuasca, of sacred plants? Was there any strong message what to change in your life, like coming from that Western culture? Do you recall something like that?
Well, one thing I think that's important to say is all of these plants are deeply personal, and they very much work with us where we're at. At the same time, that there's certainly universal archetypes that all of these plants embody. Ayahuasca was maybe kind of the gateway plant, or because it's not actually one plant, it's at least two, and sometimes even more. But the kind of the gateway that opened me up to a certain way of working, to an experiential way of working with many different plants. In terms of a message, again, it's very personal for people.
Sure, I
I
understand.
think what I was looking for at that time, kind of as I alluded to, was this sense of connection, this sense of being able to experience different realms of consciousness, to travel to different dimensionalities, to other states of being, to be able to speak with, to understand, to communicate with other forms of consciousness, and really being in a state of awe, really being able to experience that. And that's exactly what ayahuasca gave to me. It's what it opened to me, and it really, I think, opened those gates, and then very much invited me to come back and to form a different relationship with that. In the many times that I worked with not only ayahuasca but tobacco or Iboga, as we were speaking about earlier, so many different trees and master plants. I mean, they all have their own medicine. They all have their own teaching, and they're all working with us in a very particular way with where we're at. And so certainly there's been a tremendous amount of teaching in that entire process. But yeah, I guess in terms of ayahuasca, it was very much answering a need or a deep desire I had for this much deeper connection to the cosmos.
Mm-hmm. You have mentioned words like higher consciousness or God. What is your understanding of God, of higher consciousness? Do you think that we are gods, that we create this reality?
I think a lot of these questions are very difficult to put into words, and that's part of the duality of our existence. Is ultimately in this dualistic world, those questions can never be answered, because there's also a very hermetic principle, which is as above, so below, and also this idea that all truths are have-truths. So anything that you say, the opposite of that, there's also going to be some truth in that. There's a very beautiful Zen saying, which is that the knife can cut all things, but the knife can never cut itself. And I think that's very much the nature of the mind, the nature of knowledge, that the mind can know all things, but it can never know itself. And so these questions about God is that which is beyond the mind. And so any way that the mind can answer that question will ultimately be not true. Having said that, people come to these medicines with very different intentions, with very different goals. And I think very often in maybe kind of this more psychedelic assisted renaissance or psychedelic assisted therapy renaissance, which we're in, there tends to be a real focus on the healing aspects of these plants. Even that label, plant medicine, it's kind of inferring the healing benefits of these plants, which is very real and very powerful and very important. But in many of these, or most, if not all of these indigenous traditions, usually the words or the way they speak of these plants doesn't necessarily imply medicine in the sense of like physical healing or emotional healing. There's usually some aspect of knowledge or wisdom that goes with how they speak about these plants. And I think that wisdom is a very direct and experiential wisdom. And one of the things that I also very much like about these traditions, a lot of the traditions that I worked with they very much weren't traditions of the word. They weren't traditions of knowledge being passed from person to person or teacher to student, but they were very much seen as traditions of knowledge that's passed directly from the plant to us. And so obviously that's going to be very, as I was saying, very personal to where we're at, and at the same time universal truths, universal knowledge, wisdom. And I think, for example, one of the groups I spent a long time working with was called the Shipibo people, the Shipibo Kunibo, who originate in the Peruvian Amazon, very close to the border of Brazil. And their word for ayahuasca is uni, and uni it usually means truth or wisdom. And so someone who works with uni is an unaya. It means a wisdom keeper. They have a very beautiful saying, which is hakun, and hakun means good. So hakun, ma is the negation. It means not good. But in a deeper level, from what I understand, the etymology of hakun, what is good, is it also means that which is true. And on an even deeper level, it means that's that which is life-giving. So that which is life-giving is truth, and that which is true is good. And I think there's very profound wisdom in that. And I think in many traditions, when they're speaking of God, and even in our Western traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, God is good and God is life-giving. And so anything that we do or that we focus on that's life-giving is that energy of God. And I think these are also very direct messages that plants like ayahuasca can put us in touch with. And so when you ask that question, like, what is God? It's that which is life-giving. I think that's one very simple way of looking at it. It's that life-giving energy. It's the creative force. And that's why also, like for example, in a Christian sense, man is made in God's image, because we have the power to create. And that's the force of God. And it's the force of this life-giving energy, that which joins, that's that which unites. Hakonmo is that which separates. And so that which separates is not good, because it's not true. And that's the opposite energy of God. And yet it's part of God. And that's also part of this dualistic existence that we live in.
Yeah, and here is a trick, right? Like an inception, like our ego, right? Ego is creating this separation, right? But it's also the part of creation. How do you see the future of consciousness, of humanity, of this? You mentioned the process of healing. I remember when I went to Ecuador 2 years ago, we went to the jungle where there was a local Tai over there. And we spent the night. It was such an amazing experience. We drank San Pedro. It was really, really strong. And he mentioned, I remember it was like a little bit emotional, that we are healing and healing and healing. And when finally will we heal? There was this tiredness within him, that we are healing and healing, and the process of healing either goes very slowly, or the progress is just like very little. There was like a kind of a frustration within him.
Well, I think one of the things, and this is where I find this idea of spirituality, religion, ancient traditions very beautiful, and finding the commonalities, finding the ways in which they unite, which is this idea of God, this life-giving energy, that which joins, is that these traditions share so many things in common, and ancient culture, civilization all over the world very much speaks about time in very cyclical ways. In the same way that light exists, light is a wave, so it has peaks and valleys. It's constantly moving, it's constantly expanding. And also, even in a more Western sense, this idea of evolution. So you asked about human consciousness, and I think it's very much the same. It's always evolving, it's always expanding, it's always moving. And it has these cycles, cycles where it can reach lower points, cycles where it can reach higher points. I think the nature of these plants, many of the traditional stories speak about that these plants were given to humans. Often they speak about eons ago. And I think one of the interesting things is we tend to be very... you use this word ego. We tend to be very egocentric in a way that's just very human, very natural. We tend to focus on the present above all else, the past or the future, and there's a beauty to that. It's not necessarily a negative thing. But with that mindset, we often think that either we're the greatest we've ever been right now, or we're suffering the most that we've ever been right now. You hear a lot about that, like with the climate, for example. Like, we're killing the earth, and there may be truth to that, but the earth is far greater than us as humans. That's more of I think, a human-centric way of being. The earth is far older than us, and will continue even if we were to die. I say that because we often think that we're suffering in a way that we've never suffered before. But in a lot of these indigenous stories, they would say that even eons ago, humans were suffering. I mean, even if you look at the stories of Buddha or Jesus, they were responding to a very deep human suffering. And this was thousands of years ago. So certainly thousands of years ago, humans were still suffering. Eons ago, humans were still suffering, because it's the nature of this world. And in a lot of these indigenous teachings, these indigenous stories, they say that these plants were gifts given to us by higher forms of consciousness, often very specifically from even very specific star systems like Sirius, that these beings transcended the 12 dimensions of time and space on this primordial anaconda canoe. And on this canoe, they brought with them all of these master teacher plants. And the goal of these plants was very specifically to help humans to remember who we are and where we come from. Because in that worldview, in that cosmovision, the fundamental root of our suffering is because we as humans have forgotten on the deepest level who we are and where we come from. And so to answer your question, the nature of consciousness and its expansion or its evolution, I think these plants actually play a very crucial role. Plants and fungi as well play a very crucial role in the evolution of human consciousness to continue to guide us in a deeper way to the essence of who we are and where we come from. In response to kind of this Ecuadorian healer, I mean, someone who does this work is carrying a tremendous burden because they are carrying the weight of the ills, the diseases, the traumas of the people they work with. So there's a tremendous burden that they're carrying, and it is very tiring. Having said that, it's always been like that, and this ever-expanding evolution of consciousness is something that continues to move forward, even through these peaks and valleys.
Yeah, that's a very beautiful and holistic answer. Thank you for that. That Ecuadorian healer also mentioned interesting thing. I asked him about the nature of life and origins of humanity, and he mentioned that plants communicated to him that humans we were created by the non-biological life, and we had a very deep conversation about it. You mentioned that these plants remind us who we are, and where we're coming from. So, what is your view on that? Like, who are we at the deepest level, and where are we coming from? Did these amazing plants show you some glimpse of these secrets?
I think again these are fascinating questions, and they're very much I think something that we all have to come to our own terms with and to really discover. As I was saying, that's I think one of the beautiful things about these traditions is they're also not inherently saying like this is the dogma, this is what you need to believe, like God is this or God is not this. It's this very direct experience. For example, I can give you asked if there was something that the plants were teaching, and this is where it's often hard to translate things as well, because once we put something into words, we break the story in a way, and we make it more mundane. We take away from the religiosity of it, the spirituality of it, and we bring it down from the world of spirit to this world, and always there's going to be something lost in that. And the insight that we have, it's very difficult to put it into words, and obviously that's where the great poets or the people, the bards, it's one of their gifts, is they're able to somehow take this knowledge of spirit and to make it as beautiful as it can be in the realm of language. I don't know that I have that gift, but we were speaking about Iboga, and one of the archetypal qualities of Iboga is you were mentioning that it's potentially being used or potentially being legalized in a state like Texas or in the U.S. Usually, probably what they're referring to is not Iboga, not the actual plant, the root of the Iboga tree, but ibogaine.
Ibogaine, yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the
Way stronger, like a way stronger medicine used mostly for addictions, right? And PTSD. And
I wouldn't say it's stronger. I would say, if anything, it's probably less strong because you're isolating one alkaloid within an entire universe of what that plant is. The strength is always going to be in the dose and how much you administer and how you work with it. I'm a big proponent of working with plants, not only in their entirety, but also in the tradition, because there's a lot of things that you lose out on if you're only working with what we would consider to be the active alkaloid, meaning Iboga or ibogaine, because there may be many other alkaloids that are important. An example of that is the ayahuasca brew. Often people will say something like DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is the main alkaloid, but that's not necessarily true. You have all sorts of other alkaloids like harmaline, which have very profound effects on people. And if you're only extracting DMT, you miss out on all of these other alkaloids, which have very particular and profound effects in and of themselves. So, ibogaine, yes, it's what we may say is the active alkaloid in iboga. But not only are you missing out on the plant itself, but you're missing out on the tradition. And there's a reason that these plants were worked with in the way they were working with. So even something like iboga, there's usually a tremendous preparation that goes into that, a cleaning of the body, a cleansing of the body, a beginning to work with smaller doses of iboga, building yourself up, doing certain rituals, certain dances, and then going into, as I was mentioning to you, the death ceremony, and then that's followed by the rebirth ceremony. There's a music that goes along with it, which is extremely powerful and extremely advanced. And this may sound strange, but an extremely advanced technology that's literally beginning to put the brain in certain frequencies that allow the iboga to work in a much deeper way. So to answer your question about maybe a direct experience, during that death ceremony, and this is where kind of things are very personal, and there are certain archetypes that come up. And I think one of the archetypes that often comes up with Iboga is it can very much take us into the nature of the mind, which the nature of the mind is addictive, it's looping, it's infinite. That's why Iboga or ibogaine is being used very successfully to treat addictions. But that's not necessarily correct in that, like, Iboga or ibogaine is treating the addiction. It's treating the mind. And as the mind is healed, the addiction begins to fade away. And one of the things that Iboga does is it takes us into all of these negative thought patterns, all of these cages, all of these webs, all of these beliefs that the mind has, and things that may have been buried for ever since we were a child, and depending on our cosmovision, maybe even before we were born, patterns that were imprinted on us by our family, our ancestors, our cultures. And these things often come up, and it's very, very shocking in a way, really seeing these patterns that we go through. And through that death ceremony, through that rebirth ceremony, those patterns are begun to be freed, and new, and more Western terminology, like new neural pathways are able to open to literally break those addictive pathways. But one of the things that came up for me was very much seeing the nature of the mind, and kind of it was showed to me very much in this. It was very otherworldly, very, very of the cosmos, of the universe, and it was like this gargantuan machine, this unending machine, very metallic and mechanical, sophisticated.
That's very interesting.
But also
But
very...
are you talking about the human mind, or more the universe, the cosmos in general, or both?
Well, yeah, I would say for me it was both, and it left me. This was also after a period of deep fear, a period of feeling like I was dying, and then resigning to that.
But
And
during that experience, or the period in your
during
life?
that experience, yeah. And then this resignation came over me, and it was just then very much seeing this kind of cold, mechanical nature of the universe, of the essence of everything, and this resignation that's all there is that there's just these continuous cycles of birth and death, and that there's literally no meaning behind everything. It's just very cold and dark and mechanistic. And from that experience, when that resignation really set in, and that's where the music was very powerful, is the music literally began to sing something new back into my existence. There's also these rituals of looking at a mirror, and very often we begin to see very deeply the nature of ourselves, and how that begins to change and to morph. And this human figure that emerged from that mirror exercise began to come alive through the beauty, through the intricacy, through the technology of this music. And what it showed me is that way of looking at the universe was not correct, because that way of looking at the universe was devoid of the very thing that animates life, which is life itself. And that was a key, or the key, of the animating force of the universe. We could call it God or the vital force, but that without that, the universe is cold, it is mechanistic, it is infinite. But there is an animating vital life force which gives meaning to our entire existence, to the existence of the universe. That may sound nice, it may sound crazy, because again, it's trying to put an extremely vast experience into words. But what that taught me is that life force, that God energy, that literal animating force of the human being, of life, is vital, and that it's good, and that it's always there, and it's something for me to also never forget, because that animating force is the force of the universe. It is the nature of who we are.
Mm-hmm. That's very, very deep and very profound. Maybe we can go back one step and try to explain to people who will be watching and listening to us those differences between Iboga and Ibogaine. Just I did a lot of research about it, and a lot of people say that like Ibogaine is like a way stronger version. It's like coca and cocaine. That it's like way more intense, but it's a completely different plant molecule technology. Would you agree with that?
Well,
have you personally tried both? Like, have you get into the experience with Iboga and Ibogaine?
In my own journey, I've never been very interested in working with isolated alkaloids, because again, what interests me is not
by isolated alkaloids. You mean Ibogaine, right?
For example, Ibogaine, or DMT, or nicotine, or cocaine, because all of these alkaloids come from a very sacred plant, and it's the plants that have been used with traditionally, and also, as I was saying, it's not only the plant, and I think that's sometimes where we in the West, we have a very reductionist way of looking at things, which is beautiful, which is good, but there's a downside to that, and we forget about everything else that comes along with that. And these traditions, There's a beautiful quote, I think, by Isaac Newton, who says, if I've seen further than others, it's only because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. The fact that we're even able to isolate an alkaloid is only because we've stood on the shoulders of giants, of cultures, of traditions who had very deep connections to these plants and who knew the potentiality of these plants, which even gave the idea to someone that this plant is sacred or good or has a benefit to look at it to be able to potentially isolate some alkaloid. But all of the traditions that go along with that, like I was mentioning with Iboga, are for me vitally important, and not just for me, but the people who've worked with these. There's a tremendous technology to them, and like an example I'll give you, it was a very common experience when I worked at the Temple of the Way of Light. Is a lot of people, most people came down, and it was the first time they had worked with ayahuasca. But many people had worked with ayahuasca previously, and a very common thing that they would say is they'd come down and they'd experience ayahuasca via this ancient technology. And they would say, oh, like, I didn't realize, like, this is what ayahuasca is. It's not how I had worked with it in the past, that there's something much deeper to it. And so when you're speaking about ibogaine, again, ibogaine is one of the alkaloids in the tree Iboga, the Iboga tree or the Iboga plant. Strength only and always has to do with dose. Mm-hmm. Period. So when you extract that, when you isolate and you extract the ibogaine alkaloid from the Iboga plant, it's up to the practitioner of that, usually in a more medical setting, how much of that they administer. You could administer a minute dose, like what could be called like a homeopathic dose, and it would have very, very little effect. Or you could administer what in more Western terms could be considered like a flood dose, and it could have huge, huge effects, even to the point of death, because most of these alkaloids have some degree of toxicity to them. I mean, any alkaloid does. Really, anything in life does. Water is life. We need water. And water has a toxicity. If you drink too much water, you can die, and that happens quite often. So the strength simply has to do with the dosage. In terms of, as you say, the quality of the experience, that's going to depend on myriad factors. Again, who's the practitioner administering the ibogaine? What is the setting, the kind of famous set and setting? What's the person's intention? Where are they at? What's their physical state of being? What's their mental state of being? And again, if you are working with Iboga in terms of the plant, again, what's the quality of the person administering it? What's the set and setting? What's the tradition? What's your state going in? So there's many factors that will alter the outcome of that.
I've started microdosing Iboga cousin, which is called Tabernate Mani, which translates to many eyes. Have you heard about it? Do you have some experience with it?
Tabernath is the family, and you have a number of different plants in that family. That specific one, I don't think I've heard of, no.
Okay. It was recommended to me, introduced to me by, we have this amazing guest on the podcast. She also introduced Ash Ritter to us. That enormous amount of wisdom and understanding came with that microdosing. Like, I'm assuming that many eyes, it's like a metaphor of looking at things in the universe from so many perspectives, and this universe of Iboga start calling me like superbly heavy, and I'm preparing myself to experience something as you called flood dose. Do you remember what was your dose during your experience? Have you done it just once or a couple times?
Well, there's usually different ways that you can work with something. The way I worked with Iboga was in a tradition called the Buiti tradition. It's said, from my understanding, that Iboga, the knowledge of Iboga, actually originated from the Pygmy people. They were the first people to use Iboga, and they had a very elaborate knowledge of it. The Pygmy people were also eventually enslaved, and I mean they have a very rough history. But in Gabon, where some of them live, that knowledge was given to the indigenous people of Gabon. I don't know whether it was by force or voluntarily, but eventually that formed into the Buiti tradition. And you have at least two, maybe even more different traditions that work with Iboga, but probably the most well-known is called the Buiti tradition. And that's the tradition that I worked in with Iboga with. And as I was mentioning...
Yeah, I heard about it. One of our guests on the podcast was Martin Boll, and he had an amazing conversation with a person, I don't remember the name, who had a church of Iboga in States, in Washington, state of Washington. Maybe you heard about this person. I can find it a bit later. And he talks a lot about it. About those indigenous people and all those traditions. Yeah, but please continue. I don't want to interrupt you. Because this is a fascinating subject for everyone who is listening to us right now. Isn't it amazing? Just one more thing, that like building a context that so many people out there, when I meet a lot of people in Western world, especially nowadays when we create Beyond podcast, we meet a lot of people. That most of these people, they never heard about it. About such a technology, such an amazing tool.
Well, I think that's the fascinating thing of going into traditions, of learning from traditions around the world is you do see these commonalities. I mean, I remember it was very interesting because Iboga also very much works on the three aspects of time: past, present, and future. And many people, well, I don't know about many people, but people will go, in essence, back in time and kind of see the advanced technology of the past. And that happened to me, and it was very interesting because I asked
did you call the past as technology, that the past is technology?
Yes.
That's a really fascinating thing. I love that.
Yeah, and I asked the woman who I was working with, because to me there was this very strong correlation to Egypt in the more recent past, and she said something that was quite mind-blowing, which is that the Pygmies were actually part of the spiritual advisors for the Egyptian pharaohs, and to me that was very fascinating.
Wow.
But yeah, that's this idea of also beginning to understand that the commonality of all of these things. But in terms of the Buiti tradition, again, I'm not an expert, so I can't really speak from a place of authority. All I can speak from is my own experience, that which I've learned. I know and work with a lot of people who work with more deeply with Iboga. But from my understanding with the Buiti tradition and the way I worked with it was that there's usually a preparatory experience of cleansing, of cleaning, of beginning to prepare one's body, mind, and spirit for the experience. We worked with like a smaller dose, and then that's building up to what's called the death ceremony, where you take a very large dose. And
Those were increased like during like how many hours or how many days? Was it like?
it can be a ceremony where you work with a smaller dose. Traditionally, it's usually over the course of like a week, 2 weeks,
That's what I heard.
where you begin working with smaller doses. Iboga, it's the root of the Iboga tree, and so you eat it. It's called eating Iboga, and so you usually eat spoonfuls. And so that builds up to the death ceremony, and then the death ceremony gives way on another day to the rebirth ceremony. And then usually after the rebirth ceremony, where you're working with a smaller dose, but still a very strong dose, then there's usually a process of integration, which can last days, even weeks, of really beginning to come down. And you're in a very vulnerable state, so you really need to have people, even a community, to look after you, because it very much is a death and a rebirth. So you're almost like a baby, and you have to be cared for and nurtured back into kind of your rebirth into your human form, into this existence. So it's usually a very elaborate process, a process that requires a lot of time, a lot of dedication, a lot of courage, and a lot of support from other people.
So what would you recommend to someone who would like to start this journey, the experience Iboga? And do you know any amazing right places, like which countries or some retreat centers? Because there's so many people out there looking for this technology, for this healing. How to prepare, how the one can prepare to such a life transforming, as you mentioned, death, rebirth.
Well,
Experience.
one of the things is I don't recommend anyone to anyone because I mainly because I don't want to be involved in people's processes, and
Okay.
it's not something like narcissistic or anything, but it's um, a big part of this process is that we have to be responsible for our choices, and our choice can't be Jason told me to go to this place, and then if it's good, Jason's great, and if it's bad, Jason's bad. I think that's not a correct way of doing things. I think primarily the place you have to start with is yourself, and to really have a deep calling to do this work, because it's very difficult, whether you're working with Iboga or tobacco or ayahuasca or wachuma. If you're going into a big process, which is traditionally what most of these plants were, they were initiatory processes, usually worked with over the course of quite a while, whether that's days, weeks, months, often years of an initiatory experience. You very much have to have that calling, because if you don't, you'll run away. You'll stop. The experience will be too much. So that calling has to be there. And then really doing your research. I mean, we also live in an interesting time where we all have access to the internet and podcasts, things like we're doing, and to really find a place that resonates. I in general, I lean towards working with plants in their whole form in a tradition, because there's a tremendous amount of depth and wisdom that you can miss out on if you don't do that. Having said that, there's also a benefit to working with a particular alkaloid in maybe a more Western setting. Working with Ibogaine in an Ibogaine clinic where they can monitor your health, where if you do have a severe reaction, they can hopefully bring you out of that, or even bring you out of a death reaction. If you feel more comfortable in those situations, that's very valuable, and that's something to really listen to. Not everyone is going to be comfortable in a more kind of traditional jungle setting, so that may not be ideal for someone. If you're dealing with maybe very specific things like opioid addiction, that may be something that's beneficial, is working with Iboga specifically to try and break that, and to be in a setting that again can monitor your vitals, and that hopefully can also keep you after that experience when you are very vulnerable, whether that's for a few weeks or a few months, and being willing to do that, understanding the risks of what you're doing, and then taking the necessary precautions to really be in a place where you won't have any counterindications, and to where that work can really settle. So, that's what I was saying. It's going to be different for every person. In general, as I was saying, Iboga, the tradition that I'm familiar with is the Bwiti tradition. That and there's a few other traditions that originate primarily in Gabon, but I think also Cameroon. So that's where someone would go if they wanted to work with it in its place of origin. There's also increasingly people who have trained there and who hold Iboga retreats outside of places like Gabon. I have two very dear friends and teachers who, for example, work with Iboga, but they hold retreats in the Netherlands and Colombia and Costa Rica. So those can be beautiful people to work with as well. And, maybe there's more comfort in those places. It's easier to get to. Travel to Gabon can be very costly. You have to deal with everything that entails: the jungle, the mosquitoes. There can be real issues there too, like malaria, and the malaria can be very strong. So it's also important to take precautions for that, to understand what those symptoms are. So, but more than anything, really desiring to do it, preparing yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, really beginning to cleanse yourself, to be mindful of your food, to be mindful of everything you're putting in your body. I would say really beginning to cut down on news, social media, finding time to be more introspective, spending more time in nature, really taking care of yourself physically. If you don't have a physical practice, starting one, whether it's yoga or running, but making sure you're also physically prepared for these medicines, because physically they can be very taxing on the body, mentally, emotionally they can be very taxing on the body, and ultimately they're spiritual medicines, so they're going to take us into the nature of who we are, and so to really be prepared for that.
Mm-hmm. So you personally experienced Iboga in Gabon?
Interestingly, I experienced it in the Amazon. The people who I worked with
in Peru.
In Peru, yeah, it was a woman, and I believe she was the first Western woman given the authority to work with Iboga in the Bwiti tradition, and it's her and her partner, a lovely French gentleman. And they were very close to the center, close energetically to the center where I was working and the people who I was working with. And so they came and did one of these kind of initiatory experiences with Iboga there.
So if it's not a too personal question, would you be so kind and share what happened during this death and rebirth within you?
Well, I shared a little. I'm quite hesitant to share much more, because I think these experiences are deeply personal, and there's something very, very sacred and very beautiful. I guess what I could say is that in retrospect, the three ceremonies that we did very much also correlated to these aspects of time, taking me very deep into the past, very deep into the present, very deep. That was the death ceremony, very deep into the nature of the mind and what that means to be of this world, to have a glimpse into the nature of the mind. And then also it very much worked in the realm of the future, very much as you spoke about, this idea of the evolution of consciousness, of where I'm going, where we're going as humans. into the stars, into the cosmos, what that journey is like, what it is that we're looking for, where is home, and the nature of who we are. And those kind of, I guess, questions that I had that I may not have even knew that I had were very much worked with and shown to me. And it's very powerful, very profound. I have a tremendous respect and awe for that medicine. It's truly a gift of God, and it's profound beyond our wildest imaginations. I think if we work with it in a good way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing even that small part of it, and I fully respect the personal aspect. Would you call it the most profound experience in your life as it comes to experiences with plant medicines? Or that's also not